piece on time. And I'd just done my undergraduate degree in drama and theatre arts, and then my master's in English literature. It was before I went to drama school at Webber Douglas, and I was kind of at the time I was sort of playing with the idea of doing a PhD in Anglo-Jewish drama, and I had in mind a certain
PhD is always a bad idea.
Yeah, well, I actually filled out the whole application, and then I never put it in the mail. I decided not to. But I was looking for a certain kind of play, and I had in my mind, well, this is the kind of play I want to research, and the kind of play I want to write about, and it'll have some kind of biblical theme, and it'll have contemporary edge to it, and it's going to have sort of Torah references to it, but kind of be very much, I suppose, kind of cutting edge. I was looking around for this kind of play, and then I realized that I couldn't find it anywhere, so I had to write it, and so that's where it began. So the theme of Limud, the theme of that year was time. So the verse which came to me was, "There's a time for everything beneath the heavens," from Mishlei, from King Solomon. So it or even Kohelet rather. So it occurred to me, okay, well, if that's the final line in the play, if we kind of end up at that point, and Ecclesiastes being the last part of Solomon's life, then what would be the play before that? Then can we work our way back from there? So, you know, what would have to happen in order for that to be the finale? So just for context for everyone, so I wanted Raphael to co-write it for me. Raphael was deep in a PhD in quantum physics at the time. And Raphael's like, "No, I'm busy, I can't do it. I'd love to, I can't do it. So I spoke to Jacqueline. I said, "Can you tell Raphael to do it?" And she said, "Yes." And then Raphael's like, "I guess I'm doing it now." So then Raphael sat down and we started doing it. And we started sort of finding our way, looking at the material and looking at, well, okay, there are many ways of telling the story of King Solomon. And it really began with the question. I was taught in yeshiva. So I'd been in yeshiva at Hamiftal with Joel Winston about 3 years before that. And we were taught that better to have a good question, like a gute kasha. It's not necessarily about the answers, but the yeshiva training was very much in the question. And so the question I was coming in with at the time is, well, what do you do with, how do you make sense of someone who's an esteemed king of Israel, who has 700 wives, who had 300 pelag shot sorts, so 1,000 women in total, wrote 3 books of the Bible between the Song of Songs, Book of Proverbs, and Ecclesiastes, built the temple in Jerusalem. And how does this all fit together? So we started sort of finding our way through that, and it was quite an amazing story of, or amazing adventure of midrashim, and looking at what was pshat, what was the surface level in the text, what the hidden parts were, and telling one story. So there's a beginning of an answer.
Yeah, I mean, I remember actually, because what you worked out was that, you know, King Solomon famously wrote 3 books, Song of Songs, and as you said, a Mishlei, Proverbs, and then Kohelet. And we found this midrash that said he wrote Song of Songs when he was young, and Mishlei when he was middle-aged, and when he was an old wizened man, he did Kohelet. So we thought to do it in those kind of 3 stages of what is the humanity. And the clash between me and you was, I wanted to just learn the text and look at the commentaries and different options, and you kept on saying, but to dramatize it, it has to be different, and you can't just have multiple readings. You have to go with one. Do you want to explain about what drama demands of a biblical character, which might be slightly different from normal traditional biblical study?
Yeah, I would say it was the MGM logo, or the MGM catchphrase was "Ars Gratia Artis," which means art for art's sake. Right. So the art cannot serve anything else but itself, because the character's got to live freely within the play. The writing has to be completely encapsulated and serving itself. And what I mean by that is, as soon as it starts serving an agenda, so let's say it's to promote a religious message, doesn't mean it won't necessarily be successful. The Christian evangelical film market, made for TV market, is absolutely massive. There, you know, within the Jewish world, within the Jewish religious world, there's stuff which serves a message, but ultimately there has to be room for interpretation. So the reason why Shakespeare is so, or one of the many reasons why Shakespeare is so enduring, is there are so many different ways of reading it. The art which is going to serve serve its purpose and kind of live over time. So Hamlet, it can keep being played one way and being played another way. You can keep finding the depth within it. So the clash came here. The essence of the clash was, we're both observant Jews, we're both teachers, and there is, within teaching, like there is a kind of a sense of what's kosher and what's not kosher. So as soon as you start showing Shlomo HaMelech, King Solomon, in one particular light, it may not be favorable, and it may not be palatable, and it may not be firm or acceptable or even kosher.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, exactly. So we had the issue that he had to be challenged by issues, but he couldn't be over-sexualized, and it couldn't be in a way that denigrated him. It had to be kind of and thoughtful. And what you said was like, if it's weighty, if it's done well, then it won't, if it's not cheap, right? If it's thought out, then it won't feel an attack. Often things are attacked when they're like cheap jokes or something like that. But if it's meaningful and has pathos in it, then it will be respected for what it is. And when you did it Limud, it had a great response. But in terms of this issue, you've performed it many times. Right, and a couple of rabbis were nervous when they spoke to you. So explain what their issues were, maybe after seeing it or something.
Oh yeah, I mean, no, I don't know if I like achieved the status of being called a heretic, but it kind of, that would have been a good thing. But no, it definitely wasn't. I mean, it was definitely sort of quite strongly disapproved of in some areas. But I think it would be just from what you were saying before. Yeah, it's got to be truthful. So. Look, I was playing kind of free and easy with it. We were very specific as we were writing it, that anything we're saying, we kind of, and I'm not sure there's a correct answer, but like, we were very specific in terms of saying, look, anything that goes in the play has to be something, if we're going to have a character, or if we're going to have an event happening, it has to be something that was rooted within Jewish tradition. So we have to find a source for it. Just as if you're teaching a shir, so it's either got to be the pshat, it's got to be a surface level thing which clearly appears in the Tanakh, so it's got to be there in the Book of Kings, where the story is told, or in a midrash somewhere, or it could be in a Gemara reference. So that was kind of our perspective, but equally I was trying to play it as truthful as I could. At least kind of every artist is going to do it through their own filter. So at the time when I was 25, when we first did it, was 1999. So I was like, well,
oh, Marcus, you're slowing down. Is it me, or has somebody got this as well? Marcus, is your connection okay?
It should be okay.
I think it's those rabbis interfering again. Oh, Marcus has paused for a second, so I'll fill in the gap till he comes back. Oh, you're there. Okay. Marcus, I wanted to ask. So, when did you last perform Solomon?
I performed it. It was in the summer of 2017 at the Hollywood Fringe Festival. I think actually Ben Winston may have been at the performance, as it happens. Ben showed up. It was, in fact, he was there. That was the last performance. It was in 2017. In August, and then that was about 7 weeks before I was hit by a car and nearly died and had emergency brain surgery, which is another story for another day.
Yes. Well, okay. So, and how do people react to it in LA?
They loved it, and it was enduring work. And just for context, we did 4 of these plays, and I performed this one in about 18 different countries over time. They reacted very well with it, and this was the interesting thing, because it was originally meant as a piece for Limud, and then it kind of grew. Then it grew into a play, or it sort of expanded a bit over time. And the whole question of, okay, well, how does it play before non-Jewish audiences? And so it worked very well. And it's the first time I performed in America. I think it was with you in Cage, or in Long Island at the Jewish Educators Conference in 2001. First time I performed in the States. I was very excited because at the end of the show, everyone stepped up and there was a standing ovation. But then having lived in America for 10 years, I discovered that everything gets a standing ovation.
Right.
So what are you gonna do? Everything's awesome. So it came across well, and I know we were going to talk about when I performed it in Colombia for a bunch of Spanish speaking.
Yes, so tell this story, because I remember this very clearly.
So I was in Colombia for touring, working with some American with Latin American Jewish students out there, and so performed it in the Andes, in the foothills of the Andes. They have something called cuenterio, which is storytelling, and I was worried how would it go across, because these are primarily Spanish speakers. And the thing was that it went across as well as it go to an English audience. They speak English well, but they were Christians. It was a Christian university, but it still worked. And this is kind of the long loop back to the essence of this, which, or I believe in terms of our conversation, which is when we're truthful about the Tanakh, when we're truthful about the text, something is going to work. It's going to speak to you whichever language you're in, like whatever your background. The more specific you go, the reason we relate to, say, My Big Fat Greek Wedding, or the reason Fiddler on the Roof is currently being performed in Japanese, it's as long as it's truthful and specific about it. There's a great documentary on Netflix with Lin-Manuel Miranda about Fiddler on the Roof. I did a playwriting course many years ago with Kwame Kwei-Armah, who's now the artistic director at the Young Vic Theatre. And one thing Kwame was encouraging me at the time was saying, like, write Jewish and go specific into your tradition. I was saying, no, Kwame, I've got to go broad. I have to go broad, otherwise it's not going to go anywhere. He's like, no, go specific. And he's like, no, and so it took me like 15 years to understand what he was saying. But like I finally realized that actually, yeah, the more specific we go, the more other people understand, because the more.
Also remember a great moment we had, which was, because we had the death scene of King David. I'm not sure it was in the David play we did of the Solomon. And when we read it, when David's handing information to Solomon, you and I, we read it, it just felt like a mafioso boss telling his son who to kill. I think it's chapter 2 of Melachim Bet, of who to kill. And you played it like The Godfather, and we thought it was quite dramatic. And then do you remember that summer we were in America, and Professor Everett Fox, who's on his own translation of the Bible, was teaching this text. And he said, it's very much like The Godfather. And we sat there going, yes, because he was a great, biblical scholar, and he was analyzing it, basically telling us that our reading of it had a lot of truth to it. But I remember you also did King David, as you said, and you did King Saul as the madness of King Saul, which was a very taxing play, if you remember, because we talked about the end of Saul's life when he loses faith with the prophet Samuel and ultimately is killed in battle. And it was a tragedy. And I remember you were very emotional afterwards, and it never occurred to me that an actor could become so involved in what they're doing that it affects you psychologically. And I felt I had to look after you afterwards, because it was no, seriously, you were transformed. I mean, is that something that always happens?
Well, look, I'd forgotten about that actually.
Sorry.
I mean, no. I was in tears while writing it, and it was an intense process. And I think, but I want to kind of broaden it, like, if I may broaden it just sort of for context, and particularly picking up on the Everett Fox comment, and every actor, everyone's got their own way of processing it. It wasn't that I was trying to go to that place. It was just the darkness of that particular story of King Saul. So, you mentioned King David. King David, as his dying speech to Solomon is, here's a list of people who you have to kill, because literally, here's your assassination list. Go do this. Here's how, then you can kind of go and be king and build the temple. And yeah, with Saul, the mental health crises which he goes through are intense, and I don't know how it'd be diagnosed today, whether by probably comorbidity of schizophrenia, multiple personality disorder, bipolar mania. I'm not sure what it would be, but there is an intensity, and then you've got King David, or the young David, being the first music therapist. It's literally musical therapy. I mean, David comes in, plays his harp, and it says, and the king's mind was soothed. But in terms of the Torah approach, or the Jewish question, I think one thing we got to within it was often sort of within Jewish education, the perspective would sometimes be, hey, let's make it cool. Like, how can we find the cool angle? But actually, I felt that by living with these characters, by getting deeply into these characters, it's all in there. Like literally, as it says in Prekevot, hafach bava, hafach bava, kulubo, like turn it and turn it, you're going to find everything, everything within it. And it's pretty amazing. And I think just for context, then maybe we'll go on to the yoga.
Yeah, absolutely. No, and I think that's very true. And so our approach to biblical characters is the Tanakh tells it as it is, and therefore it's not denigrating or in any way them. It's actually understanding them, and through trying to act them out, it's transformative. Now, I want to talk about, just conscious of time, what you moved on to next is you've got, and I've got all the books, my Kabbalah sutras and the kosher sutras. You got very involved in yoga and meditation. Especially when you're in LA, and the Jewish angles to it. Can you tell us that story and what you were trying to do?
Yeah, so thank you, product placement. Thank you, Raphael.
I get no commission, everybody. I just think they're really good. So there you go. Carry on.
So it was the wrestling, look, as we're going to be reading and very, very soon in shul or at home when we're reading the Torah, the idea of the name Israel being defined by Jacob, Yaakov is wrestled with God. It's this wrestling with God and overcoming. And then at that point, he's given the name Israel. So we are God wrestlers from one interpretation. So the thing I was wrestling with at the time was I was at drama school at Webber Douglas in South Kensington. And I was learning yoga. We were learning yoga as part of our acting in terms of the focus of it, the idea of sort of this oneness, this stillness, and being able to breathe and have our mind on one singular point. And at the same kind of time, I was getting more frustrated within shul in terms of just shul being shul, with no disrespect to Anglo Jewry. It's kind of been very much my sort of birthplace, and I'm back here. But just how can we find some creativity within it, or unleashing the creativity, unlocking it that's really there. But so I was at drama school, and we were learning this yoga, and then I was practicing every day just really for my own acting exercises. So how can I strengthen myself as an actor? And so it was one Shabbat morning, I was doing what I could remember, about 20 minutes yoga practice, and then I went to shul in Watford, where I grew up. My parents are here. I noticed at the end of 3 hours in shul that, well, one of those experiences in the morning had left me very free and energized, and one of the experiences hadn't left me free and energized. And I was like, well, hang on, there's something out of balance here. And for me, like often people would say, well, hang on, okay, I find my spirituality in the yoga and the meditation, and so therefore I'm going to go there. And if you go around India, apparently to majority of ashrams, there's a disproportionate amount of Jews there. I mean,
Israelis, yes, absolutely.
Because we are God wrestlers and we are seeking God. But so rather than rejecting it, I sort of started searching within it and just diving deeply. I was like, okay, so then I started looking through the Siddur and seeing all the references to the body. And it begins with it begins with the whole of the morning blessings, just Zokef Kvufim, straightening up, or Elakai Neshamash Netata Bita, or He, God, the soul you placed within me, she is pure. But the word for soul, Neshama, is spelled the same as Neshima, which is breath. So it's like, God, the breath you put within me is pure. So we can take a deep breath now, if you like. So then by looking at all these things that could refer then to yogic practice, and then Nishmat Kol Chai, Nishmat Kol Chai. So again, it could be read as the breath of all living things. And then it talks about the liver and the kidneys and the spine, and talking about the body. And then it kind of reaches its culmination in Kol atzmatai tamarna Hashem mi chamocha. All my bones will say, God who is like you. So we're in shul saying, all my bones, God who is like you. And all we're doing for 2.5 hours, or 3 hours if you're lucky, is standing up and sitting down and bending our knees. And I just said, what's up? Like, what's going on? And so it began a journey. And then I started asking more questions. Then I went through Tanakh went through cover to cover in Tanakh, looking for references, then looking for references in Gemaras, and then looking for books out there. I was like, I had it very clearly in mind, there must be a Parsha book that's gone through this, and I searched and it hadn't been written, so I wrote it, and that began the journey.
That's fantastic. And, underneath yoga, which is a meditation from another culture, there are religious overtones of another culture there. And don't you see that as a clash potentially with Judaism? Because it's bringing something from the outside? Or how did you see the two coming together?
So to do like the Bekitzer, the shortest possible, or the shortest possible one is no clash. But that's, look, I mean, I'm not teaching so much nowadays. I sort of wrapped that project up about 3 years ago when the books were finished, but I'm still sort of keeping, I run Jewish Yoga Network and so on, which is a website and an active Facebook community. And the one question I've been asked over the years, more than any other question, is yoga kosher? And there's a whole defense of sorts, saying, according to one French historian philosopher, Mers Iliad, he explains how there are 6 schools of Indian philosophy, and actually the physical yoga is very different from the Hindu stream, and it predates Vedic literature. And actually there was a seal, like a piece of clay with someone in a lotus position, that was found in the Levant area. And so they think, so there is that whole thing. One thing often people quote, which is that Abraham sent gifts to the East.
Right.
And I don't like the line that comes next, because I've heard too many people say it, like, and therefore the Jews invented yoga. And I would say, no, it's okay if we didn't invent everything. Like that's we don't have to claim full credit. And actually Rashi on that, with his last week, he says that what he sent, the gifts, are the words Shemot Tuma, like the impure words, but that's a whole other discussion in itself. So Rabbi Yitzhak Ginsburg is one of was the leading Kabbalist in terms of open education and sheer brilliance. I mean, sheer brilliance. American, but who's based in Israel. And he put out an article a couple of years ago saying why yoga is completely forbidden and why yoga is not kosher.
Really? Yeah.
And so I read through it, and I was like mounting a whole defense and ready to go out publicly, although I deeply respect him, so I would have to work it carefully. But he came up with a different argument, which I hadn't heard before, which is saying it's afar or vak avodah zarah. It's the dust of avodah zarah.
Right.
It's the dust of idol worship.
Yes.
So it's not idol worship, but it's kind of got the associations. It's like, therefore we've got to create some new moves, which are kosher. But I did pretty good, 3.5 minutes keeping it. Okay, so the end of the sentence will be, but to say someone sitting cross-legged is not kosher, or standing sort of like, standing in mountain pose like that, say like that's not kosher, or in a triangle pose, or doing a back.
I mean,
so it's complex. It's complex.
Yeah, from my point of view, there's 2 approaches. There's the more right-wing traditionalist, which is essentialist. So avak avodah zarah means it's essentially connected to idolatry, therefore it's treif. But the more modern pragmatic halachic approach is avak, the dust of, is it's associative. In other words, the danger is you'll go to that, then you'll start reading their religion, and then you'll go away from Judaism. Now, if you take that kind of process where it's not essentially wrong, it's just the associations, then if you can disassociate it, it's okay. And the truth is now, many yoga centers and all over the world are not directly connected with religion. It is now recognized as a separate thing from its origin culture, and has been taken on by different groups. And therefore, from my point of view, if you're being taught by a teacher who's grounded in Torah, if you're doing it in a Jewish context, right, then it has a whole different flavor to it. And the question is, and this is what Maimonides said, if we're learning, find truth from wherever you see it. And if there's a truth there, and there are ways of moving your body that are reflections of Kol Atzmotai Tomana Hashem from Nishma, if they're a way of expressing that, then that's what you should look at. That's the point. So for me, I have no problem with that. For me, the avak is the association, and it might lead to someone to getting too involved in that foreign culture, and that I get. And that's what it's about, disassociation. So if there is, as you've done and others, Jewish yoga within a Jewish context, then you're not going to make that association.
I don't. Yeah, I mean, I'm fine with Jewishly inspired. I don't want to say it's Jewish, because the yoga's. I mean,
Jewish context. I just mean.
Sure, yeah, exactly, Jewish context. And I think just in this, in terms of how, like, this again, back to the struggle and the wrestling and the so at the beginning, I would go to my Rabbi Ebner, Rabbi Dr. Ebner in Israel. I'd like call him and say, can I say this? Can I teach this? Is this kosher? Can I teach this? Can I say this? After 3 years, this, he's like, Marcus, as long as you're not paskening halacha, as long as you're not defining the Jewish law, it's fine. You can say it. And again, like with this, I used to wrestle it a little bit, or it was a lot of wrestling. I remember when I went to the States, like Rabbi Sachs, Shalom, was like tremendously supportive, saying, and because my concern was always, how can I do this within a Torah framework? And I remember it's once actually St. John's Wood when Saatchi had moved over there, and we davened at the Saatchi shul, or I was davening at the Saatchi shul, and then came into the Kiddush, and I think Robert, you may have been there actually that Shabbat, I seem to remember. And I was talking with Rabbi Sachs at the Kiddush, and he's like, Marcus, what are you up to? And he said, don't let Judaism get boring. It's just kind of like this sort of, supporting on. And the struggle continued. I mean, in 2017, like I'd started on and off on this sort of distance learning. I got smicha, so I got the rabbi title, and I went through the 30 tests and the 14 hours of exams. And I wasn't
on Bas V'Chalav, right?
No, I did it on Shabbat, the laws, Sabbath laws.
Not easy.
Sorry,
it's not easy.
It's not easy. But then when I got it, the yeshiva who I was studying under, they gave me a title, Ravu Manhig, which is rabbi and leader, but they didn't want to give me the full smicha. And then they were saying, no, you haven't passed, you haven't quite got this. And we kind of kept going back, and all my rabbis looked over it. They're like, no, you've definitely passed. And then they finally admitted, they're like, no, actually, we've looked you up online. We don't think you're religious enough. So
no, it's hard because rabbi, is rabbi a qualification or a title of is an academic qualification? But you've got that knowledge, you therefore have it, or is it a position in a religious community? And if it's the first one, then you pass, you get it. If it's the second one, then it's the key holders of the community decide if they think you're kosher enough to fit that in. It's an interesting thing.
Right, and exactly, and I do, respect that, and that, like, I really do respect it. I mean, it's painful. It was tremendously painful.
Of course. It's always horrible. It's always horrible to be judged.
Like being told you're not good enough, So I was then after the brain surgery near-death experience, we'll come back to that another time. Rabbi Sachs called me a couple of times, and I was telling him the story, and I was torn, and I said, for lack of a better word, I was trying to be a good Jew, and I was trying to do my best, like being true to this is, I do struggle with these things where the creativity comes out. What do I do? And the abbreviated version of what he said was, don't chase the titles. They're not going to help you. You're a free spirit. You're meant to be free. And I love him deeply for it was that one conversation that was a life changer, a pivotal point, and the idea of someone like truly being, like, I felt I was truly seen, truly seen, and part of his, his deep generosity of spirit, of heart, and his deep wisdom to be able to see. So
these political situations are, people get very nervous and they want to protect their own organization. But what Sachs was saying to you, and it's because also he knows you, is, I trust, Marcus, if your heart is pure, if you're doing it for Torah, then you won't overstep. You won't use the smicha to start doing crazy things and paskin and make decisions which are outside the tradition. You're being creative, and that will be a good thing for you to express yourself as a free spirit, and also for the Jewish people. And I believe that you are bracha for the Jewish people, and I'm very glad myself, selfishly, as a friend, that you're back in this country. But also, I think you're going to do a lot of good stuff for the Jewish people. Unfortunately, I have to go in a minute, but just as a final minute, what's your view of what kind of Judaism you want to see going forward in terms of these creative ideas? Do you think we're too stifled here? Do you think that's the most important thing? What's your thought?
Look, I don't want to judge it. I think a brave, courageous, truthful Judaism. I think Torah Judaism, for lack of a better term, I mean Orthodox Judaism, there is tremendous breadth within it, but whenever there's the feeling of suppression, it doesn't have to be that way, but there are boundaries and there are limits. So it's finding like, and it's really being truthful and being with respectful. We have a rabbinic tradition and we have halacha for a reason. Like there is a clear line in terms of an action that's kosher and an action that's not kosher. However, there's also tremendous diversity, and the thing which moves me, even gives me chills thinking about it, is we have 12 tribes. Like today's parsha was the birth of the first few of the tribes.
Right.
You know,
they all came out of love. They all came out of
right.
Leah's desire to be loved by her husband. He loves me not. Reuven, Shimon, Levi. It's fascinating. It's all based on love relationships. Amazing.
Right, exactly. And every tribe has a different set of talents and a different calling.
Right.
Some of the business people together with the scholars, the priests, you know, there are the artisans. And I think this is often overlooked. And there's often a sense of, let's get homogenous. This is what a Jew has to look like, a religious Jew has to look like. And
I love that.
God's really big. God's very big. And
yeah, I love that. Non-homogeneous, 12 tribes, different approaches. Marcus, I have to pop off now. Thanks so much. Hopefully you can stay on if there's any questions. And I'm going to pass back on to Edward now for the next part of the discussion with Robert. But if anybody's got any questions to write in the chat or want to ask, please feel free. And please God, Marcus will be in person at Central Square very soon. Please God. Love you guys. Thank you, Marcus. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rafi, and thank you, Marcus.
See you. I've got to run off. Goodbye, everybody.
We certainly all hope that you will be able to come to us face to face. But of course, until we're face to face, we're doing events like this by Zoom, and the intimacy of that, and the very forthright nature of what you shared has been very much appreciated. Ben Tobin kindly shared, I think, a very beautiful article that you wrote.
Edward, louder, please, or nearer the mic.
Thank you for wanting to hear me. Ben Tobin shared a wonderful article that you wrote called Tea with Rabbi Sack. Clearly, he was a great influence on you, and you've talked about his kindness, and perhaps you'd just like to share a thought or two of what he meant to you as we're still in Lotion for Rabbi Sack.
Thank you. Yes. So it began in. I mean, we first saw him speak he came to speak when we were students in Birmingham, University of Birmingham in '95. That was the first time I met him. But it was when I was working for UJS in 97, 98. And we were I was under a lot of pressures. I was the education director for UJS across the country and programming the winter conference. And I was under tremendous pressure to make sure I wanted to just do the best possible program I had, like the best speakers, and but I was under pressure from reform. You've got to have this many reform rabbis along, and this many Masorti rabbis, and then got to make sure this many Orthodox rabbis. And one day, like I was under stress, and the phone came up, and it was the chief rabbi, and came in for a meeting. And there was just sort of tremendous support there when I went for a meeting, and he was like, you know, I'm not a politician, you know, sort of make your decisions, do the best you can. And he was there smoking his pipe and very relaxed back in the day, and sort of tremendous love there. And then I remember we used to get invited across to his house. There was a group of young modern Orthodox educators in the early 2000s. So we'd go to Hamilton Terrace, and it was every Elul. So he'd do a pre-Rosh Hashanah shir, usually on Rambam, the laws of teshuvah, of return, of repentance. And someone once asked him, said, Chief Rabbi, you know, can we go to Lamud? Bearing in mind, he was having a very difficult time with one thing after another politically, and he said, absolutely, you know, go with our blessing. And I think he said, go with our blessing, you know, I'm chief rabbi, where I walk landmines go off, but you can go in peace, you know, go along. And whenever I'd sort of said the things I was doing, like, you know, I remember before I moved to the States in 2009, I said, look, I'm going out to reform shuls and reform communities and conservative communities. And I think his acceptance and his sort of cheering on, it's like kind of go along. Maybe it was his, I don't know, the influence from the Lubavitcher Rebbe in terms of people being a shlicha or a shaliach rather, like being a messenger going out there. But there was always the sense of confidence of saying, no, you know, I trust you. You know, the creativity is not threatening the core. Far from it. It's contributing to it. And yeah, it feels something, I don't know, like it really feels like there's well, obviously there's a tremendous loss, real feeling the loss, just on a personal note. Having a connection like that is, you know, it's a lot to lose, but the Kabbalah, the Sefer Tanya, teaches that actually a righteous person is stronger in death than they were in life. Like their spirit is stronger. So there is some solace there, but I think, you know, I'm grateful to at least had that.
Wonderful to hear. I've put a link to the article in the chat box, and I've also put links to various books of yours that are available on Amazon. Other booksellers are available. So thank you so much. And now, Robert, could you unmute and...
I'm unmuted, I think.
Yeah, great. That's lovely. So yes, you've been asked lots of questions on the media. At this time, why don't I just ask you to talk about the issues in relation to COVID that you'd like to address for just a few minutes?
Yes, well, I'd quite like to answer any questions. I think I don't want to take too long, because I think I don't want to take away from what the message is that Marcus has been given us. It's lovely to see Marcus this evening. So really, we feel very, very pleased to see him. And we've been very, very friendly for a long, long time. I mean, I think the issue at the moment is I suppose surrounds vaccines, and just briefly, while Marcus was actually talking, I listed the various strategies for making a vaccine. There are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. I've listed about 15 different strategies for making a vaccine, all of which are totally different biological processes. So it is very, very complicated. The other thing, of course, is that normally it takes a minimum of 10 years to get a vaccine to a stage when you can start to inject it into people for real. So this is an extraordinary development. And I think one of the things that's really quite interesting, I just wrote a tiny little piece for the Telegraph for Christmas. One of the journalists asked me to do this. He said, would you write a very short piece to ask God to refrain from torturing humans, because we are in such a black period at the moment and we need some relief from it. And I wrote a piece which suggested, actually, on the contrary, I thought we should be rather grateful, because at this stage of human knowledge, things are happening exponentially fast, which are hugely to the benefit of humans. For example, science is really developing in an extraordinary way as never before. It only happens really in times of intense conflict. And I think it's not just in science. I think also, I think it could teach us a great deal about human responsibility, about human behavior, about community. And we should be learning a great deal and changing a great deal as a result of the virus. And certainly, I think that's something which is very easy to forget. And I think young people are being taught that this is a very black time. On the contrary, I think it's a time of great opportunity. And I think we should grasp that opportunity, and we should recognize that it will be there. I do understand that the economy is obviously very seriously affected, but I'm reminded of Daniel Defoe's Diary of the Plague Year, which he wrote, well, he published it in 1722, a long time after the Black Death had finished in London, or at least the big plague in London had finished. And it's very interesting. If you look at that diary, which is full of eyewitnesses' accounts, it's very clear that the upper classes who weren't so badly affected by the plague. I mean, it killed about 1/3 of London's population, but they were mostly poor, living in very bad circumstances. What we see, of course, is that the well-to-do people were complaining vigorously about the economy, were saying, this is appalling, we're never going to recover. Well, just a year later, in 1666, Christopher Wren comes along and completely rebuilds the East End of London, which is where the plague started. And it's nothing to do with the fire, because by that time, the plague had actually attenuated. That's quite important. We see from that account that actually the Black Death was already on the decline. There was no particular medical treatment, but this is the history of these things. They do decline. So the importance of the antivirals and more particularly the vaccines that we now have is to encourage that decline. So when various manufacturers, and by the way, just for interest, I've just very quickly looked up the number of vaccines which are in far development. There are about 51 different vaccines which are listed by the Center for Disease Control in America. And very proudly, we can argue that a lot of them are British, which is great, but not all of them. Some are going on in India. There's some very promising ones in China, and there's one, of course, in Russia, which is already being used. Though there are some concerns about that vaccine. But each of them has a different process. The one that's being developed by Imperial College is quite interesting and rather unusual because it is a messenger RNA vaccine. So it alters something which, of course, normally would be responsible in the protein metabolism, and therefore, if you can modify the mRNA, and you can by rather clever ways, you can then actually produce the body producing its own new antigen response, which in fact is not like other vaccines. These vaccines are a bit different, and they have the advantage of probably having very low side effects. Because the mRNA, this particular molecule, doesn't actually enter into the nucleus of the cell, so it doesn't alter the fundamental genetics of the cell. I won't go into all the various ways of making a vaccine because there are so many, but people might want to ask about them. But essentially what we've seen at the moment is that there are a couple of vaccines now where there's a dispute about exactly how effective they are. One says 60%, or they say 63%, though actually the 3% doesn't much matter, and one is about 90%. Well, there are very, very few vaccines which are 100%. One is the rabies vaccine. And I remember one occasion filming for the BBC when I was about to film vampire bats, and I went into a hollow trunk of a huge tree in Costa Rica, where there were hundreds of vampire bats at midnight in complete darkness. And I said to my cameraman, do you mind giving me my injection of rabies vaccine before I go in? I looked at my cameraman, he was about 6'3", and I decided, no, actually on second thoughts, don't worry, I'll give myself my own injection. And then I went into the tree. But the rabies vaccine is rather different because it's virtually 100% protective. And these vaccines have different side effects, but most of them have to be pretty safe because, as I pointed out I think on television, the ethical responsibility with these vaccines is very different from a drug, because with a drug, you're treating somebody who's ill, and therefore you might make them worse, but you hope to make them better. But with a vaccine, of course, you're giving this compound to hundreds of thousands of people who are perfectly well, and you might make one or two of them ill. And so one of the great risks, undoubtedly, is how the public and how we understand what the risks are, so that actually people can recognize that, very, very unusual side effects are pretty uncommon, and therefore, in fact, the ethical responsibility is justified. Now, a vaccine which produces, as has been suggested, only a 60% immunity would be a huge advance. It's not nearly as bad as people would recognize, because, of course, if you have that amount of people vaccinated, if you can deliver it to enough people, you will actually get that virus will die out. As we saw, of course, with the Great Plague of London, which was not a virus, it was a bacterium, but nonetheless, it's the same basic principle of transmission. So I think what I would say just in summary is that I think it's immensely cheering that we have at least 3 candidate vaccines at the moment, which look very close to being delivered. I know there's been some differences of opinion about the method, some scandal, as they call it in inverted commas, of the fact that some figures were fudged by one of the companies producing the vaccine. I'm not sure that that's true. We'll have to wait and see the actual data. I think, in fact, it was done in good faith. But these vaccines are quite likely to require a 2-stage injection. And the reason for that is because this new technique of giving an RNA vaccine is never been tried before. It's a completely novel technique, at least in humans. It's been used in animals. All these vaccinations need animals. Usually mouse are the main ones. So anybody who's opposed to animal research, I guess, shouldn't be taking the vaccine. But whatever. But of course, they are novel, but they do seem to have the probability they would be less risky than many of the vaccines that we have regularly used for all sorts of diseases. So I would just say one other thing, which I think is important. The development of these vaccines is particularly interesting because it gives us all sorts of new approaches to a whole lot of diseases. For example, the so-called dendritic vaccines are likely to be extremely useful in the treatment of cancer because, of course, you can actually induce an antibody response to the cancer cells, and therefore the body would destroy them. So I think there are great advantages. Now, what we don't know, there are basically three areas of protection that we have in the immune system. The first thing is the ability to produce antibodies against a disease, which of course is when we have an infection. And the second and the third are really through the white cells, the cellular immunity, both the B cells and the T cells. Now, the T cells are particularly interesting because the T cells are the cells which carry not only the killer compound, but also they have memory cells. And what we don't know is how long the memory for this particular virus will last. There's some doubt about that. And it looks at the moment as if it's going to last for at least 6 months, but increasingly there's some evidence it's going to last longer, in which case we might need an injection perhaps every year, a booster. But of course, there are other ways of boosting vaccines. There are other compounds we can give, like aluminium, for example. A whole range of different compounds will help to improve the response to a vaccine. Those haven't been tested or tried yet, but I think it's very clear that there's lots of opportunity for that in due course. And I think we should be pretty confident that we will have a good deal of protection, probably by late spring, but certainly I think increasingly that will increase during the year, and by 2022, I think we will be in a very different position with this virus. I think it's very, very good news in spite of the rough edges.
Numerous reasons to be optimistic, and good reason to be grateful for the fact that this has all happened at, to coin a phrase, at warp speed. It's happened unbelievably quickly. So, does anybody have a question? Well, thanks, Robert. That was really interesting, and it's great to speak slightly longer than the usual 30 seconds that you get allowed.
I feel very privileged. Thank you.
Okay, no pleasure. No, it's a pleasure. Okay, anyhow, a really good week to everybody. Shavua Tov.
And next week we have
keep well.
We have Harry Freeman coming to speak to us, and he, for those of you who haven't been reading the Jewish Chronicle where it's been featured, he's recently published the definitive biography of Louis Jacobs, which I'm holding up and I hope you can see. And Raphael will be talking to him about the book and themes in it next week. And until then, I echo everybody else's greetings. Shavua Tov, stay healthy, stay safe, and it's been great to have you joining us.
Thank you. Thanks, Marcus. Thanks, Robert.
Yeah, thank you, Marcus.
Thank you, Marcus.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Marcus.
Thank you, son.
Bye.